an aspiration indulge in poetry, a mature mind will often despise it and prefer to express itself in prose.
And still, the mad, magnificent herald spring assembles beauty from forgetfulness with the wild trump of April. Witchery of sound and odor drives the wingless thing man forth into bright air. And now the red leaps in the maple's cheek, and suddenly, by shining hordes in sweet, unserious dress, ascends the golden crocus from the dead.
Edward Estlin Cummings was born October 14, 1894, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at 104 Irving Street. The name Estlin, which is what his parents called him, came from the Unitarian minister Joseph Estlin Carpenter, a friend of the family and a principal of Manchester College, Oxford. Estlin's father, Edward Cummings, was a Unitarian minister as well and a sociology professor at Harvard. Edward was a crack shot, a fly fisherman, and would often tell his congregation to get out into nature. The young Cummings' mother, Rebecca, would read him Walter Scott, Charles Dickens, and Robert Louis Stevenson, hoping that one day Cummings would become a famous poet like Mr. Longfellow, whose spirit still lingered on in Cambridge. Summer months were spent at Joy Farm in Silver Lake, New Hampshire. These happy memories instilled in Cummings an innocent optimism that no discouragement or depression would ever smother. A New England childhood also nurtured in him a Wordsworthian love of nature, cultivated at the Cambridge Latin School and evident in his poems such as In Just.
In just spring, when the world is mud luscious, the little lame balloon man whistles far and wee. And Eddie and Bill come running from marbles and piracies. And it's spring. When the world is puddle wonderful. The queer old balloon man whistles far and wee. And Betty and Isabel come dancing from hopscotch and jump rope and it's spring. And the goat-footed balloon man whistles far and wee.
Counter to these odes to nature was a dark undercurrent that planted a seed of rebellion in Cummings. Up until this time, he'd been slowly drifting apart from his father. Edward drove the best cars, owned a summer house, and had a large mansion that roofed his in-laws and extended family. He'd built his son a tree house and a gazebo. In comparison, Edward was bulky and stood at over 6 feet tall. Meanwhile, Estlin was thin, blonde, 5'8", with persistent acne. Estlin became an intelligent and angry young man. Perhaps he was too sheltered as a child, with a dysfunctional upbringing. Or perhaps he blamed the incident with his dog Rex at Silver Lake on his father. Estlin and his sister Elizabeth were out on the water when Rex, his bull terrier, snapped at a hornet and capsized their canoe. The dog swam away, leaving Estlin and Elizabeth holding on to their floating seat boxes. Rex, realizing he'd left them, swam back. The whole time, Estlin shouted at him to go to shore. The exhausted Rex latched onto Elizabeth and submerged her twice, threatening to drown her. On the dog's third attempt, Estlin held Rex underwater until he stopped struggling. The siblings spent another hour alone, fully clothed, in the lake before their father happened by in his motorboat. Distraught, Estlin later found Rex's body on shore and buried him. He never owned another dog. Cummings rebelled against his father's world while remaining very much a part of it, a rebellion that carried over into his poetry, such as in the poem The Cambridge Ladies. It was a disposition well suited for the modernist movement. His first poetry lessons began as a toddler with his Uncle George. Uncle George was an aristocratic Bostonian eccentric who introduced Estlin to the mechanics of poetry and taught him that each poem need not have grand subjects like the Battle Hymn of the Republic. At age 16, Cummings enrolled at Harvard, where he fell under the guidance of S. Foster Damon, a friend, fellow student, and the editor of the Harvard Advocate, who suggested Cummings visit the International Exhibition of Modern Art in Boston, where he was exposed to Cubism through Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. Cubism can be described as viewing a subject from many angles on a two-dimensional plane. Cummings was also a painter and readily adapted Cubism into his poetry. Another influence was the comic strip Crazy Cat, a medium which used capital letters for emphasis. There were also his Harvard professors like LeBaron Briggs, who taught Cummings poetic form. Rounding out Cummings' style was Ezra Pound, who later mentored Cummings in Paris after the war. With these influences, Cummings created his trademark lowercase I when referring to the speaker in his poems. The I could signify an unassuming nature living in his father's shadow. The lowercase I could also blend the speaker into his environment, elevating the importance of everything at once. Cummings' father had made him read the Emerson essay Self-Reliance. To Emerson and Thoreau, whose impact was very much alive in the early 1900s, transcendentalism was about living contentedly in the present moment. Rooted in Hinduism, a walk in nature meant the I is no longer I, but whatever the I experiences. The environment and the speaker meld into one. There can't be a viewer without something to be viewed. Or Cummings just borrowed the I from a handyman employed by his family. However, this transcendentalist attitude may explain why Cummings placed his faith in verbs over nouns, a thing in motion versus a thing at rest. Although not all of Cummings' poetry were G-rated nature walks. At Harvard, Cummings discovered he loved drinking whiskey sours, gin rickeys, and picking up girls with friends. Cummings evokes the hot and heavy in his poem, "May I feel," said he.
"May I feel," said he. "I'll squeal," said she. "Just once," said he. "It's fun," said she. "May I touch," said he. "How much?" said she. "A lot," said he. "Why not?" said she. "Let's go," said he. "Not too far," said she. "What's too far?" said he. "Where you are," said she. "May I stay?" said he. "Which way?" said she. "Like this," said he. "If you kiss," said she. "May I move?" said he. "Is it love?" said she. "If you're willing," said he. "But you're killing," said she. "But it's life," said he. "But your wife," said she. "Now," said he. "Ow," said she. "Tip-top," said he. "Don't stop," said she. "Oh, no," said he. "Go slow," said she. "Come," said he. Said she. "You're divine," said he. "You are mine," said she.
Cummings exercised a great deal of wit and skill in keeping his poems from descending into pornography while maintaining their erotic charm. It was in these nightly Boston outings that he frequented burlesques at the Old Howard in Scollay Square. When girls weren't dancing with fans, comedians on stage would inspire Cummings with their wordplay. "Would you hit a woman with a child?" said one comic. "No, I'd hit her with a brick," said the other. Cummings had a sense of humor, usually imitating Harvard professors for laughs, unlike his staunch peer, Tom Eliot, who was attending Harvard Graduate School. Cummings and T.S. Eliot appeared in a play together, The New Lady Bantock. Cummings played second footman, Eliot was Lord Bantock. Both had a crush on the leading lady, Amy de Gozaldi, whom neither won over, although Cummings did kiss her on stage. After graduating Harvard in 1915 as class valedictorian, Cummings sold a wedding poem to his friend Schofield Thayer for $1,000. The bride was to be 19-year-old heiress Elaine Orr, who Cummings himself was smitten by. But that would have to wait. He was off to Greenwich Village, where a professor had found him a job at Collier's Publishing. In spite of the boredom of answering letters and shipping books, Cummings had written, "In New York I also breathed as if for the first time." He would continue breathing this New York air for the rest of his life, as he made Greenwich Village his permanent home, after a brief interlude, of course. On April 1st, 1917, the United States entered the war in Europe. To avoid being drafted, Cummings, through his Harvard connections, along with friend John Dos Passos, enrolled in the ambulance corps. On his crossing to France, he befriended Columbia student and Massachusetts aristocrat William Slater Brown. The pair were skeptical of authority, drank frequently, and behaved as if they were on an Ivy League campus. In France, through some misunderstanding or light buzz, the two got off at the wrong stop. In Paris, they reported to the Norton Hargis offices, only to find it closed. After a night at l'Hôtel du Palais, they returned to learn their assignments had been lost due to a clerical error. They were to remain in Paris for 5 weeks, as if on vacation. If Cambridge was the question, Paris was the answer. Cummings threw on a beret and grew a mustache. He sketched people on the street, became a regular at the Restaurant Chartier, and attended the Ballet Russe to see Petrushka and Eric Satie's Parade, with sets by Picasso. Cummings and Brown also befriended 2 prostitutes, Mimi and Marie-Louise. Cummings wrote Marie-Louise poetry. Yet, despite his sexual exploits, at 22 he was a virgin. He had morals and fear of disease to consider. At the end of their stay, Monsieur Hargis scolded Cummings and Brown and ordered them to the village of Ham on the Western Front, a few miles from the Somme. The pair wrote home criticizing everything. The food was terrible, the job of cleaning old Fords was boring, and nothing eventful was happening. Cummings, having learned French, spoke with the troops and learned they were demoralized, what with 20,000 soldiers having deserted that spring. Cummings and Brown wrote home about this too, and that a German victory was entirely possible. The pair's odd demeanor and letters home drew attention from the censors. In August, they were taken into custody and transported to holding cells in Noyon. In September, Cummings was interrogated by 3 officials. He was asked if he hated Germans. No, he replied, but he loved the French. He was separated from Brown and taken to a railroad junction, then to Briouze in southern Normandy, where he was ultimately put in the Dépôt de Triage at La Ferté-Macé in a giant room with 30 other people for 3 months. While his letters home expressed his amusement, news of his captivity left his parents outraged. Unaware of Cummings' whereabouts, his father, Edward, contacted the State Department and the American Embassy in Paris, using all of his connections to rescue his son. On October 26th, he received a letter that H.H. Cummings had died on a ship torpedoed by a German U-boat. Grief-stricken, he kept this information from his wife, Rebecca. 2 agonizing days passed when the mistake was cleared up by the State Department. Enough was enough. Edward wrote Woodrow Wilson.
Pardon me, Mr. President, but if I were president and your son were suffering such prolonged injustice at the hands of France, and your son's mother had been needlessly kept in hell as many weeks as my boy's mother has, I'd do something to make American citizenship as sacred in the eyes of Frenchmen as Roman citizenship was in the eyes of the ancient world.
Due to Edward's diligence, and the average stay at La Ferté-Macé being 3 months, Cummings was released on December 19th. Determined to lose his virginity, he returned to Paris looking for Marie-Louise. She wasn't home. Debilitated and malnourished, he met a waitress named Berthe. He arrived in New York Harbor in January, underweight, silent, and depressed. In spite of this, the incarceration likely saved his life. Although Edward still intended to file lawsuits against the U.S. Embassy and the Red Cross. Estlin calmed him down and suggested he write a book, a scathing indictment of the powers that be. His father hired him to write it. A novel was the best revenge. And there was a new outrage to contend with: prohibition. Cummings and Brown took an apartment in Greenwich Village, and Cummings fell in love with Eleanor, now Elaine Thayer, his friend Schofield Thayer's wife. But that would have to wait again. After all the trouble in Europe, in July 1918, Cummings was drafted into the infantry. He could have gotten out of it, but his artistic nature demanded that an artist see everything, and his rebellious nature demanded that he side with the little guy. He spent 6 months at Camp Devens, Massachusetts. On November 11th, before being shipped out, the armistice was signed. The war was over. He returned to New York briefly before isolating himself at Joy Farm in the summer of 1920 to write The Enormous Room. He patterned the book on John Bunyan's 17th century religious work, The Pilgrim's Progress. Edward declared Estlin a great writer and pulled some strings at Boni and Liveright to have it published. During the course of his life, Cummings was married twice. The first was to Elaine Thayer, who Cummings courted while she was married. Elaine's husband at the time, Cummings' friend Schofield, was a wealthy patron of the arts with a preference for adolescent boys, which he tried to cure with therapy appointments with Sigmund Freud. Schofield rented a luxurious apartment on Washington Square East, while his wife Elaine rented one on Washington Square North. Cummings lived a few blocks away and was paid by Schofield to entertain Elaine with restaurants and outings. Elaine and Cummings fell in love. When she became pregnant, Cummings and Schofield wanted her to have an abortion, which she refused. She gave birth to Cummings' only child, Nancy, in 1919. The Thayers still tried to make their marriage work. During this time, Schofield Thayer acquired The Dial and published Cummings' poetry from his collection that would become Tulips and Chimneys. Sigmund Freud urged Schofield to let Cummings marry Elaine, and after Elaine and Nancy visited Cummings in Paris, they agreed. Estlin and Elaine were wed by Edward in the Cummings family home in Cambridge. Upon the death of Elaine's sister, she realized Cummings was unavailable to handle life's problems. She left for Europe with Nancy, fell in love with Irish banker Frank McDermott, and asked Cummings for a divorce. Cummings bought a .38 caliber pistol and threatened to kill himself and them. His friend, James Sibley Watson of Rochester, New York, talked some sense into him and found him a tenement at 4 Patchen Place near the 6th Avenue L, a building that Cummings would reside in for the next 40 years. The divorce was signed. Cummings and his biological and legally adopted daughter, Nancy, whom he called Mopsy, were estranged, and she and her new family left for Ireland. Cummings was devastated, though kept busy, releasing his next 3 poetry collections titled And, 41 Poems, and Eyes 5. He went out with drinking buddies John Dos Passos and the Cleveland poet Hart Crane, whom Cummings described as a buff, healthy pink woodchuck. One time in Paris, Cummings tried to bail Crane out of jail for disorderly conduct, but was too drunk himself for police to entrust him with Crane's person. In 1926, Cummings' father Edward was let go from his church. Estlin saw his father's departure as a new lease on life. Later in November of that year, Edward and Rebecca Cummings, now in their mid-60s, took their Franklin auto on the 122-mile trip from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to Silver Lake, New Hampshire. The roads, some paved, some dirt, began to accumulate snow. Rebecca stopped the car outside of Wolfboro so that Edward could wipe the windshield. In a few minutes, she stopped the car again, parking on a set of train tracks. An oncoming steam locomotive saw the car and pulled the brakes. The train cut the vehicle in half. Edward was killed instantly. When the engineer halted the train, two brakemen discovered Rebecca standing dazed near Edward's body. She refused to leave the scene until they covered him. In Wolfboro, the doctor stitched her head by candlelight because of a power outage caused by the blizzard. When Estlin and his sister Elizabeth arrived, Rebecca became lucid and decided to live. To cope, Estlin threw himself into work and a new love, Anne Barton. Where Elaine was precious, entitled, and wealthy, Anne was wild, funny, and poor. Anne and Estlin had been introduced by a mutual friend, Maury Werner. As far as Anne's history goes, she'd been molested by her father and was caring for a daughter named Diane from a previous marriage to Ralph Barton, an unstable New York artist and illustrator of Anita Luce's 1925 book, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Anne was prone to cheating. Cummings tried to keep her away from her New York boyfriends with trips to Europe, but as soon as they returned home, the promiscuity continued as usual. Seeking therapy, Cummings became a patient of Fritz Wittels, a student of Freud, who convinced him that a real man would marry Anne Barton and take on the responsibilities of her child. Anne and Estlin wed on May 1, 1929, in the Unitarian Church of All Souls on 4th Avenue. Edmund Wilson, who attended, said they were drunk. As a gift, Rebecca thought it'd be a great idea to deed Joy Farm over to the newlyweds. The marriage did not change Anne's behavior. She aborted Cummings' child, became pregnant by a dental surgeon, went to Mexico for a divorce decree, and threatened to take Joy Farm. Cummings hired a lawyer and wrested full ownership. As for throwing himself into his work, Greenwich Village neighbor Marianne Moore got Cummings hooked on drama when she had him write a theater issue for The Dial. This and several poetry awards led to the Provincetown Playhouse staging his play called Hymn. This modernist production had 21 scenes, 72 characters, and 30 actors, and garnered hate from a lot of critics, in spite of its 27 performances, all with a packed house. Cummings' next work was a memoir titled Emi that cataloged the dates between May 10th and June 14th, 1930, which Cummings spent in Russia. The artistic community in Greenwich Village and Paris was hypnotized by communism in the Soviet Union, including Cummings. It sounded like a good idea, on paper. Upon his visit, he quickly saw through the bogus propaganda, observed the Russian people living in fear, and felt the beginnings of Stalin's purges. It was a certified nightmare. Cummings shocked the world with his revelatory book and lost friends over his sudden about-face. In June 1932, Cummings attended a play at the Provincetown Playhouse. Jim Light, who directed Him, and his wife Patty brought Cummings backstage after the show, where he met their mutual friend, 29-year-old model and aspiring actress Marian Morehouse. The four had dinner together at the restaurant Felix's. Cummings' first impression was that Marian was too tall for him. She was 5'11", Cummings 5'8". His opinion soon changed. Instead of his annual trips to Joy Farm, he spent the summer in Manhattan and saw Marian all the time. Marian Morehouse was primarily attracted to Cummings' irrepressible charm, spontaneity, quick wit, and his accomplishments. Cummings was also handsome. At 37 years old, he still possessed a boyish face that contrasted with his strong, masculine bearing. His dark blonde hair was thinning, but the short cut he sported suited him well. His wide, set eyes were soulful. When he smiled, it was not just with his lips, but his whole face. Unlike other men she had dated, he seemed free of poses, sure of who he was and what he wanted. What he wanted was Marian, without any more children. Their relationship was close, but with speed bumps. She cheated on him at least twice. once with author A.J. Freddie Ayer, and again with English director and documentarian Paul Rotha. She came clean to a distraught Cummings, and he eventually forgave her. They never legally married, and New York State abolished common law marriages in 1933. In 1932, Greenwich Village neighbor Edna St. Vincent Millay recommended Cummings for the Guggenheim Fellowship.
What I propose, then, is this: that you give Mr. Cummings enough rope. He may hang himself, or he may lasso a unicorn. In any case, it is high time we find out about this man Cummings. Let us give him every opportunity to show us at once whether he is a genius, a charlatan, or a congenital defective, and get him off our minds.
Apparently, they found him a genius and awarded him $1,500, which he used to take Marion to Paris and write a book of poems. While he spent his days writing, she was offered more modeling gigs for Vogue. In New York, she moved to 8th Avenue and then into 4 Patchen Place with Cummings for the rest of his life. The book of poetry, however, was not accepted by any publisher. No one was interested. His mother, Rebecca, put up the money to self-publish. Cummings titled the book No Thanks and dedicated it to the 14 publishers who turned him down. His career was at a low point, coinciding with the Depression. In 1935, he and Marion made a go at Hollywood and failed that too. No screenwriting credits, no modeling gigs. One night at a Manhattan party, Cummings met Bennington College student Helen Stewart. She and her friend Dorothy Case were huge fans and represented their school's literary committee. They invited him to speak at Bennington, an all-girls school in Vermont that focused on the individual, spiritually and mentally. When Cummings spoke, he delivered his performance without a podium. He sat at a table with a desk lamp and would continue this method in what came to be known as his non-lectures in the decades to come. By the early 1940s, Cummings was not aging gracefully. He smoked, he took Nembutal to sleep, he had 3 drinks a day, and he was diagnosed with osteoarthritis of the spine. Dr. Ober gave Cummings an elastic corset to wear that he dubbed the Iron Maiden. This made Cummings grumpy. He hated Hitler, FDR, Stalin, and the new restaurants on 10th Street. In spite of his misery, he never lost his sparkle, even when he had to care for Marion and her arthritis. The whole lost generation was getting older. Juna Barnes, who lived across the courtyard, fell and broke her leg. She telephoned Cummings for help. When he got to her apartment, the front door was locked, and she couldn't get up to reach it. To rescue her, Cummings climbed up a tree, mounted the fire escape, and crawled in through a window. Ever since, he would open his window and call out, "Are you alive, Juna?" In June 1940, Nancy Thayer, Cummings' daughter, chose not to remain with her mother and McDermott and traveled on the last passenger ship to leave Great Britain for New York during the war. She found work as a translator, and by 1943 was a typist with an agency called Your Secretary Incorporated, run by Mrs. Kermit Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter-in-law. Willard Roosevelt, who was Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, married Nancy. In 1945, Willard's mother rented a house in Silver Lake, New Hampshire, at the suggestion of the James family, who also knew the Cummings. Elaine had never told her daughter that E. E. Cummings was her father. For years, he tried to reunite with her. Elaine once met Cummings and Marion in Paris and made a deal that if Cummings agreed to an annulment, he could see Nancy again. Cummings gave consent. When Elaine got what she wanted, she refused to hold up her end. Now with Nancy so close to Joy Farm, Cummings felt paralyzed. He hadn't seen her since 1927. This was 1945. Marion advised against it. They were both already ill. For once, Cummings' therapist, Dr. Whittles, had good advice: to let things take their course. In the summer of 1946, Cummings and Marion decided to have their friend Billy James invite Nancy and her husband Willard for tea. When the couple arrived, Marion and the Jameses stalled Willard outside so Nancy could enter the house and meet her father. She was a fan of his poetry and had read The Enormous Room. She was a poet herself, to her mother's dismay, and she'd once overheard Elaine say the phrase, "when I was married to Cummings," which Nancy was previously unaware of. By the time of the visit, Nancy had given birth to a boy, which made Cummings a grandfather. When she entered the house, his voice, quote,
"seemed extraordinary, like a bell, like something come from afar, almost echoing."
They had a pleasant time, though nothing was revealed. In 1947, Rebecca Cummings died at the age of 87. Estlin remembered his mother fondly. She had really supported her son to the fullest. Whenever Estlin needed money, she was there at his beck and call. Sadly, however, she never got another chance to see her granddaughter Nancy since the 1920s, nor any of Nancy's children. Now with 2 kids, Nancy and Willard lived in Long Island City. Cummings invited her to visit him and Marion at Patchen Place. She gladly accepted. There, Cummings asked her to sit for a portrait, which he started in the spring of 1948. Cummings and Nancy would sit, and he would share stories of his past. Paris, poetry, friends, leaving out the parts with Elaine, of course. Typically, Marion would hover, and Estlin and Nancy would come down after for tea. By the fall of '48, Nancy's husband, a naval officer, was out of the job and their marriage on the rocks. They were living off Nancy's trust fund created by Schofield Thayer. Worse, Nancy felt herself falling in love with Estlin Cummings. She resolved to visit him one last time, do the right thing, and break contact. When Marion was pulled away by a phone call, Nancy pressed him for information on his friend Schofield Thayer. Estlin had always implied that Schofield was her father. Nancy then blurted to Estlin that she was afraid she was falling in love with him. There was no way around this but for Estlin to say, "Didn't anyone ever tell you that I was your father?" Nancy's world shattered, in a good way. When Marion returned, he announced, "We know who we are." It took several days for Nancy to process the truth. When she connected all the dots, she came to believe it. Although their relationship was often strained in person, what with Marion wanting to monopolize Cummings' free time, Nancy and her father got along better through letters. In 1950, Cummings befriended Dylan Thomas. According to Thomas's host, the first meeting played like this. Once they had overcome a brief exploratory and mutual shyness, Dylan and Cummings seemed happily at ease and intimately sympathetic as they came upon ways to express the curiously double-edged iconoclasm that marks the works and character of each of them. As our tea-time conversation ranged lightly over literary terrain, it seemed to me that some of their judgment shone the acerb, profound, and confident insights of artists who in their work have defined a world within the world, and other judgments showed merely the conspiratorial naughtiness of gleefully clever schoolboys. Cummings was touched to have been paid the first respect of a British poet whose work he regarded so highly. During a reading circuit at several colleges in 1955, Cummings delivered a poet's advice to students.
A poet is somebody who feels and who expresses his feeling through words. This may sound easy. It isn't. A lot of people think or believe or know they feel, but that's thinking or believing or knowing, not feeling. And poetry is feeling, not knowing or believing or thinking. Almost anybody can learn to think or believe or know, but not a single human being can be taught to feel. Why? Because whenever you think or you believe or you know, you're a lot of other people. But the moment you feel, you're nobody but yourself. To be nobody but yourself in a world which is doing its best night and day to make you everybody else, means to fight the hardest battle which any human being can fight and never stop fighting.
On the morning of September 2nd, 1962, at Joy Farm, Estlin fed the hummingbirds and observed an out-of-place blue delphinium in Marion's flower bed. In the afternoon, he went out to the barn to split firewood. Nearing the end of the hot day, Marion shouted that it was time for dinner. He sharpened the axe, laid it against the barn wall as his father had done before him, and went into the house. He walked upstairs to wash up. Shortly thereafter, Marion heard a crash in the upstairs hall. Estlin was unconscious from a cerebral hemorrhage. He died the next morning in the hospital. He was 67 years old. The funeral in Boston was kept small. Marion was too devastated to call everybody. Estlin's daughter, Nancy, was unable to come, but she sent her 2 teenage children to pay their respects. Cummings is buried in Forest Hill Cemetery in Boston in his family plot, Lot 748, Althea Path. The following decades of the 60s and 70s jived well with Cummings' playful, rule-bending poems, and he experienced a resurgence in popularity. His daughter Nancy died in 2006, and his poetry endures to this day.